But I think we are live, everybody. So let's get on with it. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar. I'm very excited to have this conversation because I've got to be honest, this has been on my mind ever since I read the wonderful report from our friends at Arctic Shores a couple of weeks ago. And some of you might have seen this already, or you might have seen the LinkedIn post I posted a week or so ago, and I have strongly recommended people download this. It is available for download, and the link will be shared with everyone watching the show today. But it's really important. Reason why is because I believe this is the first real systematic bit of research on candidate usage of generative AI tooling and what the impact of that is on all of the assessment sort of processes that we as recruiters have, and whether they're still tenable as techniques to use. So of course, generative AI has been the technology innovation over the last 12 months or so. All of us recruiters have been using it, but guess what? Candidates have been using it as well. And in fact, I suspect they're ahead of recruiters in terms of their usage of it, to the point where we are now starting to experience generated inputs into our recruiting processes that we didn't anticipate for them to be generated. How do we react to that? What tests are still accurate? What assessments are viable? Are the priorities and how we assess going to change? All of those things are stuff that we're going to discuss today. So folks, I want to just firstly make sure everyone can hear us okay. We're on Zoom, so everyone who's watching this should be familiar with how Zoom works. If you can hear us okay, check out the chat to let me know whether the audio is fine there. On the bottom, by the way, you should be able to see things like the Q&A, and there's a polling feature there as well, so get involved in all of those things. If you have questions for any of our panelists on the issue of the report, please make sure you use the Q&A feature, and that's a place where we'll go to towards the end of the conversation, around about the 45-minute mark. Now, we're also live streaming this, I believe, on LinkedIn, multiple places on LinkedIn. You could be watching this on the Arctic Shores company page. You should be watching it on the Brainfood company page. You should be watching it in lots of different places. Robert Newry, I think, is also doing it, and Jasper's doing it as well. So if you're watching it on there, welcome. Let me know again in the comments whether the audio is fine. And we've got people monitoring those LinkedIns as well. So if you have any questions, you want to pop them into the comments on LinkedIn, we'll be able to pull them in into the Q&A at the end of the show. Okay, so let's get on with it. Let's do some quick introductions, and then we launch straight into reviewing some of this data. So why don't we go with you first, Robert? Who are you? What it is you do?
Yeah, thanks. I'm so excited to be doing this with you. So I'm CEO and co-founder of Arctic Shores, and set it up 9 years ago now, and have loved the journey about coming up with a different type of psychometric assessment that uncovers potential. And I'm really excited to be sharing with everybody here today this latest research that we've done. Arctic Shores is known as being sort of research-driven thought leader on this ever since the early days that we came up with the task-based assessment, and so we're really excited to be able to share what I am absolutely sure people will find some fascinating and in many cases eye-popping insights and research.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. And Jasper, quickly introduce yourself. Who are you? What it is you do?
Sure, thanks, Hung. So my name's Jasper. I'm a senior data scientist at Arctic Shores, and my team and I have been leading the research into how Gen AI will impact the most common assessment types used in recruitment today. So basically, there were so many unsubstantiated claims floating around that our key goal was to put out data-driven research in an open and transparent way, using all the advancements in generative AI from both academics and practitioners.
Yep. Very, very good, Robert. Jasper. Thank you so much for your effort in doing this, because I know you're the engine behind this effort. Okay, folks, why don't we go straight into it and have a look at some of this data and see what we can see, and we'll go into the debate later on.
Right, so I am just sharing my screen. Give me a thumbs up, Hung and Jasper, if you can see the screen. Okay. So we've done the introductions, and so let's sort of dive in now into a little bit of background of why we're doing this, why we think this is important, and then I will hand over to Jasper. So there's, over the last several months, as Hung alluded to earlier, there's been lots of talk, some of it considered hype, about the impact of generative AI on recruitment and selection. And we're at a very, very interesting point in time today, where it feels like, oh, there's been lots of talk about all of this, but is it really going to impact us and affect us in as big a way as some people are saying? Because there are plenty of people on this call, and people who I've talked about, who've said, well, actually, I haven't seen a big impact yet. And so the point about this research is to share with everybody and give you the information that actually we are in a moment, like anybody who's thinking about or being impacted by a tsunami, in a sort of false sense of security at the moment, and that actually the ocean earthquake has happened, and there is a big wave of change that is coming our way. And so we can either use this time to prepare for it, or just wait for that sort of wave of change to flood over us. And just to sort of make that point about that wave, there is an extension now on Chrome that allows a candidate, with a click of a button, to modify their job application to link to a job, modify it to the job description, link it to their CV, and send out in a single click 400 applications. And there's only going to be more of these things out there. So the power that's in the hand of the candidate is much more significant than probably many people realize. But let's look and dive into specifically some research we did with 2,000 students in the last 6 weeks or so. One of the first and most powerful bits of information we picked up from that was that the use of generative AI tools has already significantly increased. 72% of students are using it on a regular basis, and that is up from 50% from a Sybil from Group GTI and ISC study that was done back in June. So in just 4 months, it's already jumped up hugely, and I'm sure that trend will increase. And we're not just talking about people, occasionally clicking on a button here. They're using it for over an hour a week. It is a big part of how people's in their education, it's a key tool that they are using. So that, of course, is then going to impact on how people see the world of work, and this generation who are coming out of university into the world of work, who've been introduced to generative AI. One of the other key stats we got in this was that 7 in 10 are likely to use ChatGPT in an application or an assessment in the next 12 months. So we're not talking about a small group here, even though at the moment, as at this point in time, in the last 3 months, 17% of people are already doing it. As others soon realize the benefits of getting ChatGPT, using it like a tool to improve things for you, more will then jump on to using it, and things like Student Room and Reddit are already awash with tips and ideas as to how you can do it. I think the other thing too is that because it's a tool and it's seen like a calculator for many of these students, for an employer to then say they couldn't use Gen AI in the recruitment or application process would put a large chunk off. Nearly a third said that they wouldn't like to work for an employer on that basis. It would give them a bad impression of that employer. And then if you look at another third of that, they would question the progressiveness of that employer if the messaging that was being sent out was, we consider using Gen AI to be cheating, and we don't want you to use it, which kind of seems strange if you think about it like a calculator. You wouldn't say somebody using a calculator in a maths GCSE now would be something that would be cheating. It's been a standard part of practice. So that's kind of the opinion on that. I think the other thing too is a lot of people see Gen AI as leveling the playing field. And here's some other interesting stats here. So 23%, which was above, I shared earlier that 17% were using it in the application process. But if you dive into that 17% who are using it for job applications at the moment, a higher proportion are from Black students and those with mixed heritage. So they are seeing this as a tool to reduce the gap between those who've had advantage and privilege and those who haven't. And so again, this is kind of important in terms of messaging, because if you're saying to those people that using ChatGPT is cheating, you're saying, I don't want to level the playing field here. I think the other thing too is that neurodiverse candidates find it especially helpful for helping them, not just in terms of their education, but also in terms of applications. There's a great influencer called Theo Smith that I heard last week, who talked very passionately about how technology, and particularly Gen AI, can help those that are neurodiverse. So, an important consideration when you're thinking about your messaging on this. And then just generally, students, a large proportion of students think that it is a positive thing. So this is how they feel about generative AI, an important aspect when employers are thinking about, well, what do I put on my career website in terms of giving advice on how candidates should or should not be using Gen AI in the application process. But there is a further aspect that our research revealed on this to be thinking about. Only 15% of ChatGPT users use the paid-for version. And when you sort of dive down into, well, why do the 85% not use it? A big chunk of them find it too expensive. And equally, when you look at those of the 15% that are using it, a high proportion of them come from higher socio-economic status background. Now, why that's important, as Jasper will share shortly, is that actually there is a ChatGPT 4 advantage, the paid-for version over the free version. And this is why this research and making it available publicly to people is really important, because this is moving very fast, and we really do need to understand both the positives and the challenges that the Gen AI tools present for us. So this is the big debate of where we find ourselves now, and why having research and really understanding the realities behind this is so important for everybody, and thinking about it now. So we've shared with you that quite a few students feel that it levels the playing field. So using generative AI tools will give some candidates a leg up. But because of some of the differences in the paid-for version versus the free version, we may be holding some people back, and all that hard work that many employers have been doing about DE&I, has to be considered when you think about a paid-for version versus a free version. Then you've got the power of generative AI when combined with human input to show great learning agility. But equally, that can be used both from a positive sense and potentially for a negative sense if they're using it to undermine, to enhance their application in a way that undermines traditional selection techniques. So these are the things that we feel employers should be thinking about, should be debating. There are no necessarily right or wrong answers to this at the moment, but we certainly should be thinking about them, and we'll be giving you some indicators as to how we think you might be able to address some of these challenges. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Jasper now, who has been is our senior data scientist. He's been working with a couple of University College London postgraduate researchers. UCL is one of the leading universities for psychometric research. And we've adopted a very systematic approach, and Jasper will sort of take you through that as to the findings on this. But we have been very, very careful to take a very measured approach to share it with everybody as to what we've done, because we think the debate on this will only be moved forward if we're working on actual data with actual results, rather than theoretical or suggested problems that might be coming down the line. So on that note, I will hand over to my learned colleague, Jasper, to take you through the research. So I'll stop sharing and over to you, Jasper.
Right, thanks a lot, Robert. Great. So what Robert showed is that there's a real appetite in candidates to use ChatGPT and Gen AI generally. What I want to take you through is what our research reveals about what the impact of that usage will be and is already in talent acquisition. So I'll be presenting some of the key takeaways from our research, but you can find out more about our research in the full report, which will be ready to download or available to download soon. You can also look at the blog series that we've done, and I believe that there will also be time for questions at the end. So the first misconception that I've often heard is that it's difficult for candidates to use ChatGPT to actually enhance their scores on assessments, that you need to be an expert in prompt engineering or a coder, for example, to make full use of these tools. The reality is that our research shows that the most effective prompting styles for getting high scores in common recruitment tests can actually be very simple. So as part of our research, we tested 5 different prompt engineering techniques. And one that we actually found worked best is just to tell ChatGPT, before you answer this question, provide an outline of the methodology for answering this test correctly. And that works surprisingly well at improving the responses that ChatGPT gives. And this actually mirrors research that's done in academia, which found that just telling GPT to take a deep breath before responding improves its performance. Because in its training data, the instances where take a deep breath and outline your thinking before giving an answer has better data in it. So you're pushing the model to use that better data in its responses. So actually, it's very simple to fine-tune the model's responses using the prompt engineering. But the other important thing to note is that as Gen AI gets better, prompt engineering will become less and less relevant. So looking at performance on verbal reasoning assessments, and this is our old verbal reasoning assessment, there are certain prompting styles that help GPT 3.5 score higher than the average candidate. But if you use GPT-4, just using the task instructions and like the base condition of GPT-4 that we tested, which is just saying you're completing a verbal reasoning assessment, here are the instructions, same as we would for any regular candidate, it outperforms any single GPT 3.5 prompting style. And it actually performs better than 94% of the 40,000 candidates who completed our old verbal reasoning assessment. So just default GPT-4 is already better than anything prompt engineered that GPT 3.5 can provide. And you can imagine that that's just a trajectory that's going to continue. As these models get better, you're going to need less skills in order to use them effectively. The second misconception is that time limits in assessments prevent candidates from using Gen AI effectively. And we did the majority of our testing using the ChatGPT API. That lets us run hundreds of tests efficiently and then get statistically valid results. However, we also tested how a candidate might approach an assessment using ChatGPT and using it easily. And what we found is that it's actually possible to complete assessments using ChatGPT as fast as regular candidates can. So I'm going to show a video that I took very early on in our testing process in July. It's a bit rough around the edges, but I think it should paint the picture for how easy it is to actually use ChatGPT to enhance your scores on an assessment. This is again for our verbal reasoning assessment. And basically, what I'm doing here is I'm loading in the passage of text from the verbal reasoning assessment and using the built-in text scanning feature on iPhones in order to just read in that passage of text. And in this case, we have copy-paste protection on our old version of the assessment. It was split into two parts. What I'm doing is just scanning that second part. And I'm actually taking a lot of time here to then go through and clean up the text to make sure that everything matches, there's no typos. But actually, GPT generally is so good at parsing text that even if it has typos and even if it has the same sentence in twice, it's able to pull out the relevant information in the passage of text. So here I'm doing edits that aren't necessarily necessary. And then I'm going to go up to the top and I'm going to write in, given this passage of text, add quotes around it. That's also not the most efficient way. Like there's very quick ways, for example, of just having given the following passage written down on the notes app of your computer, and you scan that in just like you would scan in the passage of text. I then go on to write, is this statement or, is the following statement true, false, or cannot say? And then I'm going to paste in the statement. It's very easy to also just, have that sentence written down somewhere where you can scan it in. And it becomes incredibly quick to actually get information from a copy-paste protected assessment into ChatGPT. There's the statement, I press enter, and you'll see, boom, immediately, ChatGPT says it cannot say, which is the right answer to this item, for example. And so within a minute, you can very easily get answers to existing question-based traditional assessment formats. And that's not even considering the fact that these models the input method for ChatGPT has just gotten a massive upgrade so that it can see, hear, and speak. And so there's going to be so many different input methods to get information into ChatGPT in future. The third misconception that I want to touch on with our research is this belief that, yeah, Gen AI can do some things, ChatGPT is all right, but it can't carry out human level reasoning. It's not as good as humans. And what our research showed is that GPT can not only reason as well as humans can, it can even sometimes reason better. So what our verbal reasoning reasoning testing showed is that the best performing GPT-4 prompting style scored higher than 98.8% of actual candidates. But even GPT-3 was able to consistently score above the 50th percentile, which is a common SIF point for these types of aptitude assessments. We've then also tried a numerical reasoning assessment, and ours was, we've used our old numeric sequences assessment for this, where you have to find patterns in strings of numbers in order to work out the missing numbers in the sequence. And here, baseline GPT-3 and 4 performance is actually very poor. And this is what's called the jagged frontier of Gen AI. So there's some tasks which humans find relatively easy, but GPT finds very difficult. And that said, though, even though baseline GPT finds it difficult, even with the right prompting styles on GPT-4, Gen AI is able to outperform the average candidate, which again is a SIF point that's commonly used. And it's worth noting that with just we made a small tweak to the item format of this assessment, namely to put the missing number in the sequence at the end of the sequence. And what we found is that those kind of small tweaks substantially improve the performance of baseline prompting methods. It makes it a more typical item. And actually then even baseline GPT-4 performance outperformed the average candidate. We then went on to test the performance of ChatGPT against SJTs. And we found that candidates can use GPT-3 to get around 50 to 60% of SJT questions correct, and they can use GPT-4 to get 65 to 75% of SJT questions correct, depending on the type of prompting style used. In this research, we tried a range of different scoring methods because SJTs can be scored differently. And we've included ones where you had to rank options on SJT options on a scale from 1 to 5, as well as binary scoring methods of like most effective or least effective option. And ChatGPT was able to perform similarly across all of them. So it approaches decision-making in SJTs in a very human way. Even in cases where it chose the incorrect answer, it often chose, the second best option rather than the best one. It doesn't just choose completely random options or completely illogical options, and it's able to explain its reasoning really, really well. So the fourth misconception that we've often seen is that Gen AI only works for reasoning and hard skills assessments. And we found that that's not true. So traditional self-report personality assessments are compromised as well, with Gen AI being able to score highly on socially desirable traits. So we tested this on the Neo-PAR in two main ways. Neo-PAR is a common Big Five personality survey, well validated, it works, and it's freely available on the internet. And one prompting style that we tested was explicit prompting. So just telling ChatGPT, you are completing a personality survey, respond to these questions in a way that maximizes your extroversion score. And you can see the results here. So firstly, it's worth noting that the baseline model responses, which you can see in blue, are already very good. It has high average scores in conscientiousness and agreeableness, which are two very socially desirable traits. And its responses are also very consistent. We ran baseline tests more than 50 times and only saw extremely minor deviations in the results, in the answers that it gave. So you can trust it to give the same responses in a consistent response profile. But when you ask the model to maximize extroversion, it gets a 5 out of 5 average score in extroversion, which means it's answering in an extreme way, or the highest response to every single item that relates to extroversion. And this works for all Big Five dimensions. There are also some really interesting correlations between the dimensions. So when you boost extroversion, for example, the model also minimizes its responses on neuroticism. And so this isn't something that humans can't do, right? Humans can also fake their responses on a personality self-report, and social desirability has been shown to boost scores in humans by around half a standard deviation on average. If you benchmark ChatGPT's shift in scores here against that human distribution, ChatGPT is actually able to change its score by up to 8 standard deviations compared to humans. So it's 16 times better at humans at manipulating its responses to fit a desired profile. And that led us to test out using job descriptions. So if you feed the model a description of the job task for a civil engineer, for example, which is readily available online, you can also take it, we also took it from ONET, which is the job database. You can take the baseline responses from GPT and you can boost its conscientiousness scores to the maximum and lower neuroticism to the minimum. And so you build this kind of very socially desirable ideal profile for a role. And we went one step further. We actually tested this on a whole range of roles. And these are all different roles: customer service specialist, the civil engineer one, the management consultant, a software engineer, lawyer, a business development executive, a sales role. And these are, you can see that these are all their average scores across all of the Big Five dimensions. And you can see that the profiles are roughly the same for all of them, whether they're similar, they have a similar profile. But interestingly, there are job-specific variations in ChatGPT's responses. So it increases its extroversion scores the most for the sales role, the business development role, but it only boosts it relatively little for the software engineer role, which makes sense given the nature of these roles. So you can use ChatGPT to tailor responses that fit different roles depending on the tasks in that role. And so the last misconception that we want to tackle is that all assessments are broken by ChatGPT and the use of Gen AI, and that everything fundamentally needs to change. The truth is that there's a spectrum of vulnerability, and some assessment types are actually fairly ChatGPT resistant, at least for the short to medium term. And we've, of course, tested our own assessment for its vulnerability. And we looked to apply the same methods that we used for other assessments, but we quickly found that it wasn't that simple. Because our assessment isn't text-based, there's nothing that one can simply paste into ChatGPT apart from the instructions. And when we pasted our task instructions into ChatGPT, it often simply rephrases the instructions and sometimes even gets an incorrect interpretation of the task. But generally, we're not out there trying to trick people with our tasks or our instructions. We make them to be as clear as possible. So there's relatively little advantage to be gained from just pasting instructions and getting ChatGPT to explain them. One benefit that we had from running this testing is actually that sometimes ChatGPT's reformulations help simplify the instructions. And actually, in those cases, we're going to look to integrate those updated instructions into our tasks where appropriate, to use the power of ChatGPT to make our tasks easier to understand. But ChatGPT can't complete a task-based assessment just using text inputs. Because of the interactive and visual nature of the tasks, the only way of explaining the assessment to ChatGPT via text is to manually type out what's happening in the task. And that just takes too long to be practical and can't improve candidate scores because we require constant engagement from candidates in our tasks. We've also then gone one step further and tried out image recognition software. So we uploaded images of the task to Google Bard, which has an image input feature. And what we found is that Bard struggles to understand the tasks or make any useful recommendations based on just the images. So the tasks are dynamic and interactive, which makes them complex and means that all the information isn't just captured in one image. But even in that image, there's so many elements for the model to keep track of. And these image recognition tools tend to work best when there's one main thing in the image. So if you imagine, you can use image recognition to ask your phone to find all the pictures of a dog in them, and it does that well. But when you have 10 different elements that you need to evaluate and work with in a task, the model doesn't know where to begin and in what order to approach them. We went even further than that, actually, and we tried to ask ChatGPT to write code for a bot that could then take ChatGPT's reasoning ability and apply it to the tasks in an automated way. And creating a bot used to be the domain of an experienced coder. But of course, ChatGPT has democratized coding. So we've actually gotten ChatGPT to write code for a bot to see if it works. And what we found is that we actually needed to get a senior developer in who has a bunch of Arctic Shores knowledge in order to make changes to the bot to actually get it to work. And even when you get it to work, one thing to note is that bots are so much easier to detect, and we have detection methods for bots, than detection of ChatGPT, which is probabilistic and which changes its response and it doesn't have a consistent response pattern. So once you start bringing bots in to complete assessments, the vulnerability goes down, actually. And these findings lead us to conclude that task-based assessments are actually one of the most robust selection methods on the market today. So I'm going to hand over now to Robert, but thank you very much.
So what does this mean now? Thank you, Jasper, for those insights. So now that what are the implications on that? Clearly, there's some important misconceptions that we've been able to reveal, and I think the first thing is just to understand on a sort of vulnerability matrix, where do the different types of assessment and selection methods sit? And we've created something here. I have to give a little bit of intellectual property credit to Al Bourne from Sova on this, who started my thinking around this a bit as well. But you can see that thinking about what the level of skills required on ChatGPT prompting on one axis, and then the sophistication of the assessment on another, and some will be more vulnerable than others. And I think that was the key thing that we wanted to get across. Of course, there are nuances around SJTs, there are nuances around some multimedia reasoning ones as well that may or may not be susceptible to ChatGPT. And of course, it's changing, as Jasper was saying, with new releases as ChatGPT 5 comes out. Now it can look at images. So this is a moving target on this. All the more reason to be thinking about, where your own assessment might be more vulnerable or less vulnerable, but there's no point kidding yourself that it may not be vulnerable at all, and hopefully the research that we've done here will help support your thinking around that, and we we'll share a bit later as to how we think you might do an audit on this. But nevertheless, there is a scale here of vulnerability that we should all be aware of. Then it comes, well, what do we do next on this? And I really like, again, have to credit the deter, detect, and design simplicity of this to Capfinity, who came up with this earlier this year, as to, okay, well, how do we manage this change that's coming along? Does deter, does detect, or is it redesign the options here? So let's go through some of those. On the deter and detect side, the deter, I just don't think is going to stand up. We showed the early research on this, saying to people you can't use Gen AI is going to put them off. It's not something that they will understand because they see it as a sort of tool like a calculator. And in recent discussions I've had with HelloFresh, HSBC, Slaughter and May, the early careers team, they're all saying, no, hang on, we've got to embrace Gen AI, and so we need to give guidelines on it, but we can't tell them that using an everyday tool is cheating them. I think also around detect, will that work? Might do in the short term, but you've got challenges around this, that AI detection often produces false positives on this. Even OpenAI had to withdraw their own AI detection tool because it just wasn't accurate enough. And then if you don't want to flag it because there's risks around that, then the only other option on the detect bit, we've already shown on the, you can't stop people copying and pasting because there's other ways around that. So then, you have to go and put in, do you put video on there, video proctoring? But we've already seen lots of surveys on this that people don't like that. It has GDPR implications on it. It tends to create more anxiety in an assessment when we're trying to reduce anxiety in there. So overall, I think on the deter and detect side of things, it might work in the short term around this, but it's not a long-term solution. And there are some unintentional impacts around taking that approach. So you then start looking at, well, what's the long-term approach here? And I think we are going to have to look at a redesign and really start thinking carefully about that. And for us, there are three elements to it. The whole point about generative AI is a large language model. So anything that relies heavily on language-based foundations is going to be at risk of enhancement from a generative AI tool. So the only sort of safest, or not so the only, but one of the safest ways to address this is to move away from a language foundation model to one that is more task-based and less reliant on a linguistic reasoning capability. I think the other element to this, could be no right or wrong answer. We did see that it was very easy for ChatGPT to come up with answers to a binary selection or answer approach to this. But even ranking ChatGPT was starting to get good at. So this requires even more nuances as to how you set up the responses for any kind of assessment or test. And I think the last thing, because it's moving very fast and we can see with the latest developments of ChatGPT and other tools around this, that the time-based approach is not going to be a limiting factor here, and that items will have to be refreshed and novel very quickly here in order to make it harder to actually get a generative AI tool to produce a response within a shorter time frame. And that refreshment, that novelty is going to be a key part in a long-term foundation around this, because there's no point coming up with a solution that only works for the next 3 months and then there's a new version of ChatGPT or Google Bard that comes out that then undermines that. You know, your selection and design for recruitment systems, particularly in early careers, you know, set a year in advance. So you want something that you know that's going to be robust for the future. And then the last thing in terms of sort of, you know, suggested call to action here, as I mentioned earlier, is to have a hard look at your recruitment process and just look at the different steps as to where you are filtering people and check to the vulnerability. We can provide the prompts that we used as part of our own testing here. It was by no means, we didn't cover every single element of it, partly because or every single element of every type of SJT out there. Some will be more robust than others. But the point is, you do need to check the vulnerability on this, because what you don't want to find is that you think that you've got a secure selection method and it turns out that it isn't. And the only way to find that out is to actually start using some of the prompting styles that we were doing, the research methodology that we used to determine what that level of vulnerability might be. So just to finish up on this, we have the full report that's out there. We're very much trying to move the debate forward on this, trying to sort of break through some of the shock factors, hyperbole that's being thrown out there around Gen AI and what it means for selection and recruitment, particularly in the sort of volume space. And so this is the report. We'll share with everybody in the chat how you can download it. It'll also be available via the Arctic Shores website. But on that note, Hung, should we sort of dive into perhaps some questions that might have come up from people based on what we've shared?
Yes, how very interesting. Wasn't that interesting, everybody? I kind of told you this is a report that everyone needs to download. I think it's really significant for the industry. I do believe one of many that's going to emerge, but Arctic Shores have been very early with the delivery of these types of outputs. So yeah, it's free to download. Just go ahead and grab it. I think it's something that we need to read for ourselves, but also share it with our hiring managers, our C-level, whoever it is that's out there, because it does kind of show some really interesting signals as to where we're going. A couple of things on housekeeping, folks. Please use the chat function, but can you default that to everyone? Make sure everyone can see what you're saying. Because right now I think a lot of people are just sending it like to host and panelists, but let's be open about the communication here. So just default it to everyone and have a chat there. And if you do have questions specifically, use the Q&A feature, because we want to just centralize all the questions in one place so that we can get to them in time. Okay, so what I thought was super interesting, there's so many things that were interesting, guys. One of the things that it's all right, Paul, I think you can, but let me know if that everyone feature doesn't appear. It's obviously a configuration thing that we could probably fix at the back end. Zoom does like its configurations, I'm afraid to say. But okay, one of the things that I really wanted to sort of wrestle with here, because it has really deep implications, was, I think it was the last insight you shared, Jasper, about how ChatGPT can actually, I wouldn't say understand, but it's almost like defaulted to be able to express personality traits that seem to align very much with what employers typically approve for hiring. So we want people that are personable. We want people who are curious. We want all of these things. I mean, that's generally speaking, when we interview somebody, these are the check boxes. We're saying, yeah, really good communication skills, or even worse, I think this person could be a great fit, so to speak. So all of these things are based on some of these qualities. But it seems that the GPTs, have they been like pre-programmed for this? Have we trained them, pre-trained even, so that they give us the responses that seem friendly, so to say? Is that basically what's gone on here, Jasper?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hung. So the way that ChatGPT in particular has been trained is through something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So it's incentivized and it's actually penalized for giving responses that don't conform to the profile of a helpful, friendly, and honest assistant, which is in many roles kind of what you want for an employee at work. You want them to be honest, you want them to be helpful, and you want them to be friendly about it. And that is a persona that has been pre-built into ChatGPT. But one thing that GPT is really good at, GPT, let's be clear, doesn't have its own personality. But what it does, what it is able to do is adopt a whole range of personas really, really well, and take information and translate that into its persona.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's super, super scary, isn't it? So psychometric tests and personality assessments and stuff like that, they're going to be, I mean, some of these things are not going to be tenable. I particularly like the chart where you sort of displayed, I think, Robert, that was in your section, where you displayed which types of assessments were most vulnerable, most exposed, and which ones weren't. And it's pretty stark, because I think a lot of us are using the ones that are most exposed. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, folks. Are you using tools that you now think might need re-examining based on what you've learned today with regards to what ChatGPT can do? Not only can do, but this is apparently what job seekers are already doing. So they're telling us, yes, we're using it. Not only are job seekers using it, but they're using it without necessarily feeling that it's an unethical thing to do. They're just treating it pretty much as like, hey, this is a tool. I'm going to get past this system. It's totally, as of course I'm going to use that. So you can anticipate that this will be very widely used based on whether the question is going to be who's got access to it. But it seems that enough people have access to it, so it will be pretty much sort of, when you're processing candidates, you can guarantee there's going to be a growing percentage of people that have used artificial intelligence to basically boost their performance. And if that's the case, then do the assessments matter in any way? Are we kidding ourselves? Really, really tough.
And just on that, Hung, there's a couple of questions in the chat on that about, why do we put video interviews as being vulnerable to this? There are all types of video interviews, but the most commonly used one is asynchronous, where typically there are 3 questions. A question pops up, a person gets somewhere between a minute and 90 seconds to think about their response to that question, and then they record it. And of course, at that point, the question pops up. As Jasper showed on there, you have your on your phone on that one, you screenshot it, put it into ChatGPT. What would make me a great lawyer working for this firm? It will then give you the answer for it. You've got your script in front of you, and then you deliver it. So that is a way you can deliver it. Now that clever use of ChatGPT there, that may be a good thing for it. Is it bad that somebody's got a scripted response to it or not? These are things we just have to figure out a bit on this. But it is going to distort things compared to what we had before. And that's the point. We live in a world now where Gen AI is like a calculator. It's a tool. We didn't have that before. So we have to think about what the implications are going to be on our old way of doing things.
And I need to add as well, like, even the synchronous videos are not immune or insulated from the use of generative AI. I mean, some of the Very early examples, we've seen software developers run programs that basically can give you a teleprompt based on the question that's being asked in real time. And you can imagine that being at least of some support. Imagine, you might be prepared to answer the question, but you've also got a running teleprompter at the bottom of your screen telling you, oh, make sure you say this. So suddenly, even the tool, which I think is probably now the predominant tooling that we use as recruiters, certainly on the first or second stage interaction with candidates, the Zoom interview, there's substantial reasons to doubt whether that's going to be something we can trust, because we're going to be making decisions based on what we kind of impressionistically receive from the other person, but is that person using some support and some software? You could even use a computer, like a phone. I mean, I just checked as you were talking, Robert, what's available for me to, and there's like tons of kind of like apps where you could set this as a recorder and it'll kind of try and answer the question for you. And it'll basically be available slightly off screen so that you can actually get that as support. So that's not even touching things like deep fakes or the use of further technology, which is going to happen. So what we're talking about here, folks, is not just throw everything out, but we're just trying to peer down the road to say, look, how tenable are these tools? Because I think all of them have got a half-life now. And the decay of these tools in terms of viability, I think, will differ based on what it is. By the way, folks, let me know in the comments whether you suspect you've actually received input from a candidate that has been supported by AI, whether it's an application, a cover letter, an email, or even on the videos we discussed. Have you seen it? Yes, no? Let me know in the chat. I've already had anecdotally reports of people saying, yes, I've definitely seen this. And I think this is going to be a growing concern. Okay, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I was going to say, Hung, and that's such an important, because everybody's saying, oh yeah, I've seen a bit of it, and usually it's very obvious. And this is back to my tsunami point earlier on there, that the sort of sense of false security is, oh yeah, no, I've seen people using Gen AI and they've used it poorly, and therefore it's going to be so obvious that I don't really have to worry about it. But of course, that's just so early on now. It's like a calculator. People will work as they get more familiar with it. Another generation who've used it more in their education will get better at it. It will get better. But also, if you've got people from lower socioeconomic status groups using it to help level the playing field, you need to give them some guidance on all of this and say, yeah, use generative AI. That's good. But remember that it's going to be obvious to us if it just comes across as a staid approach, and that the best way to use Gen AI is actually to put your human element on top of it. We still need to know the real Hung. We still need to know what your creativity is like. Don't just rely on it. And I think we have to give that advice. We can't just say, oh, it's being used, we can spot it, and then we're just going to reject that candidate.
I do like that. Was it the Capfinity that came up with the detect, deter, and design? I mean, so that I'm going to write about that, because I think more people know about these 3Ds. Firstly, the detect. We know that basically AI cannot particularly do a good job of consistently detecting AI generated outputs, and the risk of getting it wrong, I think, makes it untenable to even attempt the technique. Because imagine if you're the person that asserts that a candidate has used AI, you've instructed them not to use it, you claim to have detected it, and you've bombed them out of the interview process, but it turns out that they can prove that that didn't happen, and you have actually just falsely accused them of this. That has got to be a litigation issue. And we've already seen, by the way, that ChatGPTs of this world typically don't like things like second language speakers who are not like native in the first language. Oftentimes they see the usage of English from a second language speaker to be, oh, it must be generated because it doesn't sound like English, but actually, yeah, persons can speak English perfectly fine. It's just that they're using it second language ways, maybe adopting some native idioms that drop in that don't quite go, don't quite chime in. So high risk to do the detection method. I don't think that's tenable. Anybody trying this is going to basically be slapped down with litigation. The deter, we have like an EB problem with deter. I mean, candidates, whether they're using AI or not, may decide, I don't want to work for a company that's telling me I can't use technology like this. I remember, I'm kind of old enough to remember where things like YouTube was banned in the office. Do you remember this? I think some companies might still do this, where they're saying, no, you can't surf the internet. It's a distraction. And it's the same. I would have the same attitude. It's like, if this is a company that's trying to constrain my ability to use tooling that is self-evidently useful, then I can't see myself working for that company. I don't think it's the right culture. I'm out. So you've got a choice here. If you want to try and deter people, that you're going to deter people, like you're going to repel them far away, and you're gonna exacerbate your hiring problem, because who's going to basically submit to that? May not be the type of person that you want to hire. So redesign is the only solution. One of the things that was on the end of that chart, I noticed the return to in-person interviews. Now I just thought everyone's groaning when they saw that. It's like, oh my goodness. But I have a feeling that's inevitable, isn't it? Because if everything that is piped through if everything becomes digitized, which a video interview is, it's going to be subject to some sort of risk. The surface area of risk for it to be AI enhanced, enabled, or whatnot is going to be increased. Person sitting there in front of you, that's got to be the hardest thing to try and fake in any real sense. So are we going to have to rewind the clock in a totally unexpected way back to what seems like the Jurassic? But folks, by the way, this was only 5 years ago we were doing in-person interviews as a default. It was only the shift to remote that made it an anachronism, but it might be we need to bring it back. What are your thoughts on this, Jasper? I mean, do you think it feels like a really ugly solution to this, to say, right, let's do in-person again? What are your thoughts? Do you think it's inevitable we go back to that?
Yeah, so two thoughts there. One of which is, the in-person, then you're dealing with the human bias, right? Humans are biased as well, and it's a really tricky thing to eradicate bias when you're not using the most objective methods. And face-to-face interviews, for all intents and purposes, aren't always the most objective methods. I think it's worth thinking of assessments in two categories. I think hard skills assessments, take coding, for example. Those types of assessments will just need small tweaks in order to still be relevant. So you can basically, allow the use of ChatGPT, just like you would allow the use of a calculator in a math exam. And then you have sort of construct-based assessments that, measure verbal reasoning ability or your resilience. And if you're able to use ChatGPT in the assessment context, but then you get into the workplace and you're in person with people, and suddenly you need to use the same competencies but can't rely on ChatGPT, then ChatGPT will break the relationship between your ability to how you appear on the assessment and how you are in the workplace. That isn't the case for all roles. But that's definitely the problem with allowing the use of ChatGPT in assessments which are vulnerable to it, which are kind of construct based.
You know what? So what I'm hearing from you, Jasper, is that we kind of, and this is an old rule in recruitment, but we have to align the assessment to the job itself. And if the job contains these things that we want this person to do, then they should, in as close as possible, be replicated in whatever assessments we try. This is, a real world assessment, if you want to call them that, or some sort of work task or whatnot. Obviously, that's the best thing to try and do, but there's a practical impediment to it. A big part of the reason why we ended up using a lot of these assessment tools in the first place was because we wanted to scale it out. We found it impossible to essentially do the due diligence at a certain scale. So obviously, the best, if you're recruiting one person, guess what? You can bring them in, you can work with them, you can even give them a short contract, try before you buy, you can do all of that stuff. But if you're hiring 1,000 people, how do you actually deploy a system that can hire that volume of people and still be valid when a lot of these technologies basically are going to distort, I think is the right word. We don't want to say cheat. It just means that it's distorting it. And we're not able then to make an accurate decision. Now, a few people have mentioned, look, isn't it the case that you're hiring an AI-enabled person anyway? Like the job is going to contain some AI. We want this. So what is the big deal? I think that's a very legitimate sort of comment. have you two got any thoughts on this? Like, if someone says, using your calculator example, Robert, like if someone has used ChatGPT to fly through this process, and we do want the person to use ChatGPT, is it simply legitimate to assess this person based on the output, AI enabled or not, and say, right, whoever's got the best result, we presume that result is going to translate in the workplace, therefore that's an accurate hire. Thoughts on that?
Absolutely, Hung, and it's a great question on that. And I was talking to Yasser Ahmad, who's the global VP for HelloFresh yesterday on this very topic, and he said, yeah, you've got to embrace Gen AI, bring it on. If they're using clever ways of Gen AI to project what they're capable of in the recruitment process, then brilliant, because we're going to want that level of creativity and capability when they come into our organization. The problem is that our recruitment process is not designed for somebody to be using a tool like that. So as the education sector is a good example on this, you have to rethink now how you're going to let people embrace Gen AI tools, and therefore how you're going to assess them. So, that's absolutely true in the education sector, where they're saying, we expect you to use Gen AI tools, but when you come into the classroom, then we're going to want to see the human element of that. And the way that you get graded is probably as you're in the classroom, rather than what you submit as a piece of work, because you just don't know at that point as to whether how much of that is AI and how much of that is the individual. And I think that's the point here, that you need to embrace it. And then when you start with that embracing bit, you then have to go, okay, well, what are the implications now in my recruitment process that hasn't been designed for this kind of tool to be around? And I think the last point on this is that we have to rethink what we want to measure. And that's the other point you were saying on this. What's the point of verbal reasoning, testing somebody on that one? Because actually we've got ChatGPT that can do it for us. And it's like, what's the point of testing somebody's mental arithmetic? We don't need to do that anymore because we've got a calculator. So there are things that we've been trying to assess for that was human capability, that actually that's going to be done by a tool now. And there's different elements that we want the human to bring.
Are human beings, though, just vehicles for AI? If that's the case, then perhaps it doesn't matter what human being we use, so long as they've got a base level ability to use the tooling we give them, and actually we care more about the tool output than we do the human being. So I think I'm very, very sympathetic with your argument, Robert, but I'm also thinking, where does that point us to? Because are we actually thinking that, okay, if output only is what we care about, then why assess humans at all? Like, should we just like have a very blank slate approach, and say, right, everyone is just going to put on these things, almost like a kind of surround themselves with this AI, and we just care about the AI, really. So I think there's things we've got to think about. But I'm pleased that we're getting this conversation going. This conversation is going to continue, but I've just noticed the time, we're way over where we need to be. But I think that it's wonderful that you have started the conversation, you meaning Arctic Shores. I would anticipate a lot more companies will start producing research of this type. I would also strongly encourage all recruiters out there to do your own research. Have a look at survey your candidates blindly if you want, but go back to the ones that you've already processed and ask them, look, have you used any of this AI? Would you use it? Stuff like this, and get a sense as to where you're at, and then have a think about what parts of your recruitment process need to be reworked and redesigned. I'll leave it with a final thing, by the way. I don't think there's any company out there that's providing any support or consultancy on how to do the redesign. Because as you mentioned, Robert, we have kind of defaulted to a recruiting process that just didn't assume that we would have this level of technology today. But it's here, it's in use, it's in the environment, and we have to catch up. So I think there's a window of opportunity there for somebody to provide some sort of support to companies that want to do an AI audit, AI sort of assessment, a resiliency audit, let's say, and figure out actually how many tools or assessments are we using that actually we can no longer trust. I think it's a hugely significant moment for us in recruiting. Good news is for us recruiters is it should mean that we are still in work because we've got work to do. We're going to be responsible for ensuring this in our own businesses. So best you take the lead on it and not leave it to someone else to ask these questions. So download the report, folks. I think Hannah's going to email this report to you anyway. So make sure you get it downloaded. There's a link in the chat stream in any case. So make sure you can follow that as well. And if you're watching this on any of the LinkedIns or whatnot, just comment to say that you want the report, and Robert or Jasper or myself will send it over to you. Okay, that's about it, everybody. We have to leave it. We're over time. Thank you all for joining. Keep onto this AI business. It's a very exciting moment. It's a little bit scary, but grasp the opportunity and get into it, and you're going to be in good shape. Thank you, Arctic Shores in particular, for bringing this research to us. Super valuable, guys.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Great.
Thank you so much.
Anytime.